Hi, this is Paul. On Twitter, a couple of weeks ago actually, someone pointed out this article to me about Peterson and maps of meaning written by Alexander Douglas. He is a professor. Where is he a professor? Alexander Douglas, lecturer in philosophy, University of St. Andrews. As a personal website, Axe Douglas. He's on Twitter. This was written June 2018, so this might not be new to many of you. Now, as I have often said, I am by no means an expert in Jung. I read this article when someone pointed it out to me on Twitter, and it has sort of stuck in my head, and for me, that's usually a good reason to make a video. The title of the article is Jordan Peterson's Maps of Meaning. No, it's not legit. And I know for many Jordan Peterson fans that might be heresy. But let's venture into it. And I don't feel myself in a position to... I know if you talk to Skip or a number of others of you who are deep into Jung, you'll have your own opinions about what Jordan Peterson got right and what Jordan Peterson got wrong with respect to Jung. And Jung is a fairly controversial figure in many respects. The same day, another person pointed out an article by a Wheaton professor on Peterson and Jung, which was newer, and I thought that one was interesting too. But I'm going to stick to this one in this video because a lot of what I'm wrestling with now, as you've seen in my recent videos, has been framing. I, like many of you, inherited frames and worldviews that those are simply the frames through which you see the world. And with all of the thinking and conversations and learning that I've been doing over the past few years, my frames have been shifting around and my frames have been moving, and I've been open to ideas perhaps I was closed to before, and I'm closing ideas that perhaps I was more open to before. And so a lot of what I'm wrestling with now is, to one degree or another, Cartesian dualism. And, in my one video, I talked about Pajon is non-duality, and someone in the comment section rightly said, no, that's really monism. Okay, so there is those labels are important, and the communities around those labels are important, but assessing the what is Cartesian dualism? Cartesian dualism, to the best that I can describe, at least on the moment, is sort of the idea of two kinds of substances. There's sort of the substance, the material in the world, and then there's almost a substance of spirit. And that's a different thing. Now, if you read the Apostle Paul, some of the things that the Apostle Paul wrote might lead one towards that, but I don't think necessarily. As I said in my previous video, people have come to Christianity and embraced it with dramatically different frames. One video that I have not made, that has been haunting and lingering, wants to do a deeper dive onto some definitions of Christianity and some modes through which it works. Because I think it's those kinds of questions that a lot of people wrestle with respect to Christianity and how to think about it. Christianity is a label of what? It's a religion. It's a way of life. It's a worldview. It's a historical. It's a historical bucket that is as vast as the sea in terms of how many different things people have tried with respect to Christianity and how many different ways it's been defined and worked through. So, yeah, there's a lot there. So in my wrestling with Cartesian dualism, or things in that neighborhood, let's say, because I'm not really pursuing these things so much as a philosophy. One of the things that I bumped into early on, and part of the reason that I rather early on was a little suspicious, along with many Christians, of Jung, after reading his so-called autobiography, which is itself is an interesting book. There's so much interesting stuff around Jung. But one of the parts of that book that really haunted me was some of his interactions with Freud and Jung's interest in the spirit world, let's say, because if I use the O word, then I sort of prejudice the conversation. But Jung was very interested in like the report of the bookshelf. What do you mean the report? There was it sounded like a gunshot, and Jung said there'll be another one. And it's like, well, what kind of spiritism are you playing with, Carl? And some of this got into this idea of the collective unconscious. And now, when you begin to try to do a dive into Jung, it's really difficult to figure out what on earth are you talking about, especially if you come at it from sort of this default materialist position that even if you're a Christian, I think there's a reason that Cartesian dualism arose and has been maintained in the way that it has, sort of as a way of carving up the landscape with respect to Christianity. And I think because of some of these divisions, the conversation that we're having about miracles and supernatural and natural and how we approach these things, it's shaping those conversations. And when I read this article about, I'll just start reading it and I'll do the commentary as in. So Peterson is a committed, though not uncritical, Jungian. He spends several pages trying to rehabilitate Carl Jung's theory of the collective unconscious. Jung, he explains, made the mistake of implying that the collective unconscious is a set of memories that are genetically transferred from parents to children. This implies an easy-to-debunk Lamarckian theory. Memory would on this theory be acquired yet inherited trait. But Peterson points out Jung need not have resorted to any such Lamarckianism. The channel by which the collective unconscious is transferred could be cultural. Okay, well, what does that mean? And having read this and having listened quite a number of times to especially the early editions of Peterson's biblical series, and getting a far deeper appreciation for knowledge that is not accessible to our conscious selves in the unconscious. Once you get that sense, you can begin to understand Jung and Freud doing their dream analysis, and Jung looking at mythology, and you can begin to understand and appreciate knowledge with knowledge transmitted by culture within our subconscious that we have access to often only indirectly. I don't pay a lot of attention to my dreams, but I dream every night and I wake up in the morning, and my wife pays a little bit more attention to her dreams, and so she'll sometimes talk about her dreams, and then I'll sit back and think, well, what did I dream about? And the more you think about your dreams, the stranger a phenomenon it is. Now, why did I dream about that? In fact, last night I dreamt about a friend of mine from this church who passed away. Now, part of the liability of pastoring a congregation with a lot of older people is that over the last 20 years, I've been burying my friends. And on one hand, that's a sorrowful passage because my friends, many of these friends in my church are older than I am, or were older than I am, and they were my friends. And friendship in pastoring, as I talked with Guy Sengstock about, is a rather complicated and ticklish thing because, unlike a therapist, sort of, you can be friends with the people you're ministering to. But there can be some complexities to that. But some of the individuals in my congregation I have grown to deeply love, and then when they pass, I miss them. And I was dreaming about one individual last night. And in my dream, I was thinking about the fact that he is dead. So how is he here in the dream? And it went all kinds of crazy ways. But the point that Peterson makes when he talks about some of these things in his lectures is, where does that information come from? Because it is information. It is knowledge. Where does it come from? How is it transmitted? And especially that question gets highlighted within the iron box of secularism, where we sort of don't permit some of the ideas about knowledge transference that were common, let's say, in the Bible. When God spoke to Joseph in dreams, it was God speaking to Joseph in dreams. And the Haitians that I ministered to in the Dominican Republic, they very much leaned on their dreams and believed that God spoke to them through their dreams. And sometimes they would come to me with dreams that they had about me and share with me the dreams that they had, and then I would ask them, well, what do you think that dream means? And then they would share with me what the dream meant. And some of them were quite interesting. And I've had some dreams in my life that I have felt were prophetic. What do I mean by that word? I just had a little conversation on the Discord server about all the Christians who prophesied a Trump victory. Well, maybe it'll still happen. Who knows? But so that gets interesting. But it gets into this question of not all of this knowledge that we have is direct. And so what this article pointed out to me is, okay, so Jung's collective unconscious was sort of dependent upon a Lamarckian theory of memory transference genetically, which, as he said, is pretty easily debunked. And Peterson says, no, there's the cultural channel. And it's fascinating to think of the knowledge that was passed on to me from my parents and from my peers and from movies and from art and from videos and from podcasts and from books that is being passed on to me not intentionally by the human conveyor and not consciously or intentionally received by me, the child or the adult. And without too much self-reflection, you can think about that in your life, how you are molded and shaped. And the little Christian song, oh, be careful, little eyes, what you see. Oh, be careful, little ears, what you hear. Well, all the care in the world will probably not protect you from what the messages and the shaping and the forming that is being transmitted to you from others who perhaps aren't even intentionally transmitting it. I just talked with Bern Power today, who pays a lot of attention to propaganda. And, there's propagandists are obviously trying to slip things under the conscious self's radar, but propagandists, ironically, are slipping other things under the conscious, things are slipping under their conscious radar. For example, Shantung Compound, which I just read and talked about in my last video, it talked about the prisoners in the camp noting that they could sort of read the progress of the war between the lines of the Japanese propaganda that they were being fed. The Japanese would have all of this glorious information about how many ships and how many ships were sunk and planes shot down and all of this sort of thing. But they noticed that these battles were getting progressively closer and closer and closer to Japan. And so, quite rightly, the very smart people that were interned in this compound were saying, if the war is really going so well for Japan, why on earth are they fighting near Okinawa? You would expect them to be, if the Japanese were going to be better propagandists, they would have maybe been battling for Denver. But the Japanese realized that at some point you push your propaganda lies too far and they simply become unbelievable because people have a sense when they're being propagandized. So this idea of knowledge transfer, which is not conscious, is a very interesting idea. Now, I think in some of the dualist ways that Christians have sort of been trying to address many of the challenges that modernity has brought forth, Christians have developed some very modernist assumptions about knowledge and how it can be transferred. And if you've got knowledge transfer that's happening in seemingly indirect ways, Christians will either default to sort of a, well, that's a spiritual thing. And so it's almost a back to Vervaeke in terms of two worlds mythology, where all of the knowledge down here is very direct and intentional and above the line of consciousness, and all of the stuff up here that we talk about spiritual is of another essence or substance or world, and sort of these two worlds intersect. And there's utility in that mapping or in those models, but there are weaknesses in that mapping and those models. And so more monistic attempts to have a much more seamless bottom up and top down, which gets into this question of miracles, whether they're of a kind or not of a kind, going back to the miracles conversation that I had with John Vervaeke and J.P. Marceau. That's where some of these issues get addressed. And also some of the work that things I've been thinking about with respect to spirit, and what is the nature of spirit? What is the nature of school spirit? There's a ton there that's going on beneath the line of consciousness that is forming and shaping and molding us. Because again, if consciousness really was an adequate and apt gatekeeper, there wouldn't be enough time in our lives to learn everything we needed to learn to be the kinds of complex, subtle, competent agents in human society that we are. And so this Jung's collective unconscious, well, if you sort of have a dualism going on, well, suddenly Jung is dismissed as a spiritualist, because that's all spiritual substance that's sort of floating on up there. And if Jung is a spiritualist up there and there's a hard line between the good side and the bad side, then, any way that Jung deviates from Christian theology now will be thrown over into the occult. And that's been done to Jung quite a bit. But now getting into this idea, because Peterson is trying to work from below, and Peterson is trying to observe some Kantian lines of conduct, Peterson is going to try to account for these things in another way. And so he's going to be talking about cultural transference. Adults embody the behavioral wisdom of their culture for their children. Children interact with adults who serve as cultural emissaries. The collective unconscious that constitutes the basis for shared religious mythology is, in fact, the behavior, the procedures that have been generated, transmuted, imitated, and modified by everyone who has ever lived everywhere. And so, in a sense, you get just as I've been talking about the rough draft that was imprinted in me, the rough draft of a marital relationship that was imprinted in me, which I really didn't discover until I myself was married and my wife broke the script. That was there. And the rough draft of parenting, the first draft of parenting that was imprinted in me beneath the conscious line that I didn't even know I had in me until I had a child. And I shared parenting responsibilities with my wife. And so suddenly I discover, well, I have a first draft. And by virtue of co-parenting with my wife, I needed to update my first draft. And part of what happens in a marriage, even, especially a long marriage of 32 years, is you continue to discover, sometimes through conflict, exactly what's on that first draft. And you bring that up to the conscious level. And as a Christian, you might decide that some of the things on the first draft of the marriage that I received from my very Christian parents was not appropriate. It has to be amended. And the same with parenting. And in fact, as your children get older, you keep bumping into the first draft because of every stage of development. Well, there's the first draft of how my parents parented me. And so it keeps getting amended and on and on and on. And to think about the fact that, now we're going to use, again, some technological metaphors that weren't available back when I started with all of this. Now let's imagine that in some ways these first drafts are documents on a wiki. And elements of my first draft are shared broadly across a culture. and not shared across other cultures. But there perhaps are deeper and other things beneath these first drafts and documents lower and lower and lower in the stack that are shared more and more broadly. And yesterday I was talking about, the interesting reality of anthropology, where why is it that anthropologists so often go off into other cultures to study them? Well, because we're too close to our own culture to study them. And so we try to find people that are at the fringe or perhaps outside of this constantly genocidal, imperial common culture that we have been sort of developing in the world. And again, one could think long and hard about that entire dynamic, and to think that there are perhaps things that are being transmitted on those weakified rough drafts broadly and broadly throughout the cultures. So the collective unconscious that constitutes the basis for shared religious mythology is, in fact, the behavior, the procedures that have been generated, transmitted, imitated, and modified by everyone who has ever lived everywhere. And in many ways, a lot of that is getting into Jordan Peterson's, first lecture in the biblical series, which was perhaps the best. I mean, he'd been sitting on that egg for a lot of years, and he was ready to get it out, and get it out he did. Peterson's theory, I think, is roughly this. We tell each other stories to which we attach conscious meanings, but the stories have other unconscious meanings. Now, this is sort of what I talk about when I talk about my first drafts. But if we sit and we pause on this idea of an unconscious meaning, we sort of get into what the Apostle Paul talks about in the New Testament, which is the mysterium. What is the mysterium? Well, a lot of people look at, it's a mystery. And a mystery, a lot of people the words are pretty sloshy and often fudgy. Well, a mystery is something that we can't know. Yeah, it's okay. But in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul uses mysterium much more in a sense of something that is perhaps not consciously known, but will be revealed. Well, what is revelation? And again, in sort of a dualist frame, we think about revelation going from one of the realms to the other. And again, there's plenty of legitimacy to these realms, all right? But modernity basically says anything above the materialist direct realm, this public place in the secular-ish modernist space within the iron box of secularism. All of that's public stuff, and the other stuff, well, maybe you might hold it private, but we're not going to bring it outside into the government lest we kill each other and treat each other like John Calvin treated Servetus. So, because we don't want to repeat that. So, in every cultural big moment, we're always trying to address the discomforts of the previous episode, which is perhaps exactly where we're going now. But anyway, so unconscious meaning. Though we don't always consciously grasp this meaning, we embody it in our various behavioral practices. Now, again, if you're a clinical psychologist, you're always working on this stuff with people. You're asking them, okay, well, common. I've been in enough therapy. Okay, sit down. Okay, what happened this week? And it's sort of relevance realization burdens to the top because it's the thing that caused you the most discomfort or the thing that really bothered you. And maybe this is why I do my little videotapes, because I'm doing my therapy and you're paying me. Ha! So, and you're enjoying it. Maybe a little therapy for yourself too. So, and so the therapists sit down and what happens this week? And especially if you're doing marital therapy, okay, what happened this week? And something will bubble up and let's take apart, let's deconstruct the conflict. And then, well, why do you feel that? Why do you think that? And, well, I don't know why I feel that. Well, and if you've done enough talking with your therapist and they know enough about your past and the first draft you've inherited, at least a little bit that they have access to within the small confines of their office and the 45 minutes that you've used, the 50 minutes that you've used to talk to them, they know a little something, and you look for all of these unconscious meanings. I mean, that's what That's what psychoanalysis and therapy does. And you expose them, you bring them up to the top. And once you expose them and bring them up to the top, you see if you can develop a little bit of agency to actually deal with them and to begin to rewrite some of those first drafts into other things. So we embody in our various behavioral practices. When younger generations imitate our behavior, they preserve this behaviorally embodied meaning. This is the first draft. Peterson's maps are supposed to chart this unconscious meaning, or some of it. We would imagine that this is probably nearly inexhaustible, and much of it perhaps not only inexhaustible, but untestable. Peterson's maps are supposed to chart this unconscious meaning attached to various culturally important stories and embodied in our behavioral practices. What Peterson does not acknowledge is that this sets him a much stiffer standard of evidence than anything Jung faced. Jung didn't need to worry if the meanings he found in various myths and rituals were not recognized by the practitioners themselves. To use his own example, the alchemists believe that they were trying to convert base metal into gold. This was the conscious meaning they attached to their lore. But for him, the unconscious meaning involved a process in the psyche, the inward taming of the inner forces of chaos by an inner redeemer, a little Christ within the mind. How did Jung know that this unconscious meaning was there? Simply by tapping into the collective unconscious, how could he validate his theory? You too would have to tap into the collective unconscious. Well, how do you do that? You do that in dream interpretation. You do that in interpreting myths. You do that. I mean, that was in some ways Jung, I would imagine, and I'm sure I'll be corrected in the comment section and by email and in a whole variety of ways. Jung continues to have very energetic and enthusiastic disciples even today. The collective unconscious is sort of out there like the internet. You keep digging and you can find it. You can find it down inside yourself. You can find it in the history books. You can find it in the Bible. You can find it all over the place. Okay? If you couldn't find it, that wouldn't falsify the theory. It would merely show how strongly you repress the collective unconscious. Jung's theory was thus miles beyond falsifiability. Far more so than Freud's. In other words, you can't falsify his stuff. Now, this gets into the whole question of how scientific was Jung, and I just triggered a whole bunch of you. I know that from having read what you've written me already. And it meant he could happily attach whatever unconscious meanings he liked to whatever stories he found. Well, isn't that marvelous? A preacher respects that because we do that to the Bible all the time. Science is easy when you can do it all with the power of your mind. In other words, you don't have to falsify anything out there. You simply assert it. Peterson's modified Jungianism, however, is open to verification by public evidence. Now, I wonder about this assertion that he makes here, because the United States can't even come to a deep, broad spread agreement on who won an election last November. We're going to come to a deep cultural consensus scientifically within the cultural zeitgeist. We're going to call it science? I don't know. For him, I said, the transmission mechanism of the collective unconscious is pattern of behavior unconsciously initiated by younger generations. So here's the thing. Well, we can sort of track behavior, but can you really track that other layer of meaning that's going on? And this is exactly what it gets into. To show that an unconscious meaning is attached to a story, you'd have to collect ethnographic data on the practices supposedly embodying that meaning. So far as I can see, this data is not presented by Peterson, and it would be pretty tough to do it. So, I mean, I think Alexander Douglas's point is a very strong one. So far as I can see, this data is not presented by Peterson. He cites several clinical studies of contemporary behavior in animals and humans, but when he comes to attach meanings to the Enuma Elish, or the Book of Genesis, he presents no anthropological data on the rites and practices of the originator of these stories, partly because it's not available. Well, what do you mean it's not available? Well, we've got some data, but as someone who spends a great deal of time dealing with ancient texts, one of the things you bump into very early on is that there's not a lot to work with. Part of the reason that the Bible is so important is because there's so much of it in a realm where there's not a lot of other. And when you look for collaborative evidence in terms of even what has survived in stone, well, that's even difficult. So behavioral evidence and the meanings attached to them, exhaustively, pretty hard to find. How much meaning can a practice embody? That's a very good question. Indeed, his study of religious literature itself is hardly substantive enough to warrant such massive conclusions. There is no evidence even of Peterson having learned relevant languages. That's true. And, to a degree, again, in my own preparation for the ministry, I was given an introduction into Koine Greek and Biblical Hebrew, but talk to many ministers who have the same education I have, and they'll say, well, I've lost a lot of it since seminary. I passed my comprehensive, et cetera, and I use a lot of little ponies and hobby horses to get by today. I don't know how much Greek and Hebrew Peterson has learned, not much less many of the other ancient languages. He's dependent on those other scholars who are doing that basic work, let alone made any comparative studies of the uses of various words and patterns of symbols in general use. I'll get to one example in a moment, but it's first worth reflecting on just how much meaning could be unconsciously embodied in a cultural practice. And this gets into the question, the not terribly easy question of what meaning is. Because even in the course of, let's say, a marital dispute, where two people know each other pretty well, and even let's say if I have a fight with my wife right now, we've been married for 32 years, I'm in my mid-50s, and my wife is a little bit younger than I am. So we've been ourselves, and we've known each other. We've both been married longer than we were unmarried. And someone does something, and what did you mean by that? And my wife will often ask me that question, and I'll have to stop and think. Now, the chattering rider on the elephant is usually quick with an answer, but as in my conversation with Poe the other day, when I asked her, why did you have a child? I mean, she's self-conscious of herself. She's aware enough of herself to say, I can give you an answer, but is that really why I had a child? Is that the kind of meaning we're looking for? Well, why did you do this, Paul? I'm not entirely sure. And then you've got, of course, the split brain studies where one side does something and the other side gives a meaning, or sees something, the other side gives a meaning, which is completely disconnected. To the degree that we're in touch with, well, what do we mean by a meaning? Well, do we mean the cause, that there was somehow a pre-active causality that we were pursuing? Now, I think most of us would say that those things are real and they exist, and we certainly do act from them. But we also know in many cases that other parts of our brain are acting, and the chattering rider on the elephant is making up a PR story. And my wife's caught me in that stuff plenty of times, that I did something and why did you do this? And I give her an answer and she's like, that's not why you did it. And then she says, I think this is why you did it. And I hear what she says and I think she's probably right. Why didn't I come up with that answer first? Well, probably because it didn't make me look good. And the rider is very much a PR representative. Partly because there are ways that she knows me better than I know myself, and ways that I know her better than she knows myself, because I've got a fair degree of bias in terms of making me look good, and she doesn't have that much bias about making me look good after 32 years of marriage. I mean, that's what happens, and so even the connection between meaning and action is a big world. Suppose there's a village that practices the following ritual. When the sky turns a certain shade, warning sent through the village, and the inhabitants relocate to a distant sanctuary for a few days. The ritual originated, let's suppose, when the ancestors of current villages associated a change in the color of the sky with an impending volcanic eruption. The descendants have no conscious knowledge of their association, perhaps it's not even reliable, but we could perhaps say that their ritual practice embodied a belief in it in some ways. And actually, this gets very much at this whole metaphorical truth conversation that we've been having with Brett Weinstein. That when the sea goes out, this tribe on the Boxing Day tsunami understood they had to go to high ground because there was a story attached to it that the spirits of the waters were angry or something like that. And again, then we're back in C.S. Lewis's Horrid Red Things chapter, where, well, there might not, the causal links between the little girl that says, well, those are poison, but then she's confused because she cuts open the poison and doesn't find horrid red things inside. There's an association there that might not be direct or scientifically causal in the way that we understand science, but the story and the behavior and the meaning are functional in a way that the picture image doesn't necessarily have to be. Just like when I think of New York City, I think of the World Trade Centers. Well, that's because of when I grew up and where I grew up and the kinds of things I often would do in New York City. And so when I visited New York City after 9/11, it was always sort of a, they're gone, because they were so iconic. And any movie about New York City before 9/11, you know, the aerial shots, we're in New York City, and it's always the World Trade Center. That's what an iconic building does. It communicates. You see through the Empire Trade Center to something that is the essence of the city. Okay? The problem that we have here is that there is just way, way more information that a certain behavior doesn't necessarily mean one thing. And to have purchase on at least something which is productive, well, now we're sort of barking up Jordan Peterson's pragmatism tree. Something that is useful in terms of the world is sort of important. Or suppose that a certain group has no concept of biological paternity, as René Girard pointed out in The Violence and the Sacred, Chapter 9. A sufficiently promiscuous society would not have to develop such a concept. Nevertheless, suppose it retains complex rituals of marriage and birth inherited from ancestors who developed these in light of their knowledge of biological paternity. We might perhaps say that the living practice of these rites embody an old concept of biblical paternity not consciously possessed by an extant group. Part of the difficulty with many of these things is that many rites and rituals aren't just transmitting one thing. They're transmitting hosts of things that are built into the practice and the behavior. So it's not the case that there's one meaning. Now, if I go and I park in Midtown Sacramento, which is often annoying to me because unlike a little bit further out, like where I am, where there's lots are a little bit bigger and there, is a little parking lot that you can park in. If I take my car down to Midtown and then I got to park on the street and then I have to look for a space, the meaning of me going to that parking meter and putting a few quarters in, that's going away too, but putting a few quarters in is the meaning is I don't want to get a ticket. But are there other meanings even beneath something like that? Some certain participation in the culture. And so then when we have the transition, let's say from putting quarters into, let's say, sliding your debit card in or using the little code there on the meter with my smartphone and yada, 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 there's layers under that. And just working with, for example, senior citizens like I do in my church, one of the things we've been trying to do during the COVID has been to encourage online giving. Well, I don't. There's one woman in the church that told me I never put my credit card into the internet because my husband, who passed away a little wise, never would either. Okay, so what are some of the things underneath these behaviors? Some of the meanings are direct and overt. Some of the meanings are broad and have almost nothing to do with what's being practiced on top. But ask yourself honestly if you can imagine a practice unconsciously encoding this content from Peterson. The unknown is unexplored territory, nature, the unconscious, Dionysian force, the id, the great mother goddess, the queen, the matrix, the matriarch, the container, the object to be fertilized, the source of all things, the strange, the unconscious, the sensual, the foreigner, the place of return and rest, the maw of the earth, the belly of the beast, the dragon, the evil stepmother, the deep, the fecund, the pregnant, the valley, the cleft, the cave, hell, death, and the grave, the moon, ruler of the night and mysterious dark, uncontrollable emotion, matter and earth. This is a description of a Jungian archetype. And the deeply implausible thing about the theory of archetypes is the supposition that every society will unconsciously assign the same meaning to the same icons, the moon, the stepmother, etc. Yet Peterson goes on, any story that makes allusion to any of these phenomena instantly involves all of them. Fair point, Alexander Douglas. It's a little broad. and in fact, we might see that many different cultures, for example, the Hebrews and their very well-known allergy to the sea. What did the sea represent? Certainly represented chaos. Jonah says to throw him into the sea, and the sailors do quite reluctantly. So fair point, Alexander Douglas. It's a little broad, and there's a lot going on here. It doesn't mean it's unfollowable, and it doesn't mean it doesn't have a point, but is it science? Does it have to be? It is one thing to suppose that every culture will develop the same concepts. After all, here now I'm playing with something. I got to pause and fix it. It is one thing to suppose that every culture will develop the same concepts. After all, humans of all cultures face the same exigencies of life. It is highly plausible that every culture will develop some concept of the unknown and hence potential dangerous. But is it plausible that every culture will associate with the same icons? Now, part of the backdrop here, again, is this genocidal consumption of cultural diversity that humanity has been on almost from the beginning. And I was talking to Bern Powers today. In our current culture, people are horrified at Christian missionaries going out and planting churches around the world. But today's culture sort of reveres Doctors Without Borders in the same way that the 19th century revered missionaries. Why? What does that say about the values of the culture? Well, I'm not propagating modernism by sending all these doctors out. Oh, really? Tell me more. You're simply showing me what your values are. It's highly plausible that every culture will develop some concept of the unknown and hence potential dangerous. But is it plausible that every culture will associate this with the same icons? It's a fair point. Even if this were plausible, is it plausible that such complex and specific lists of association could be preserved through behavioral practices? Would we have to find every culture practicing something like a ritual dance in which the evil stepmother, the moon, the maw of the earth, etc., all figure in the same role? Mary Douglas acknowledged the strength of the case that a cross-cultural pan-human pattern of symbols must be an impossibility. For one thing, each symbolic system develops autonomously according to its own rules. For another, cultural environments add their differences. For another, the social structure adds a further range of variation. Now, I really like Mary Douglas. I mean, Mary Douglas's work on something like the Book of Leviticus is extraordinarily helpful. But I'm not quite ready to accept her assertion here. I have to think about it more. She has a real point, but part of when I think about okay, what's matter for? And when I think about the ways that we communicate cross-culturally, and how the physical layer becomes sort of a really hard floor of communication. I have to think more about Mary Douglas's assertion. Douglas thought there was an answer to the case in those instances where something like physiology forms the basis for the system of symbols. And I think Peterson would very much go along with that. In fact, I think Peterson would say that, all the way from Bucko the Lobster on forward, physiology and the constraints of physical systems would contribute to the connection between practice and meaning and even symbolism. The organic systems provide an analogy of the social system, which, other things being equal, is used in the same way and understood in the same way all over the world. This is a modest claim to what Peterson proposes, and Douglas marshals significant ethnographic data to support it. It's hard to imagine any of the available data validating Peterson's enormous claim that iconic symbols fall into the universal categories of the archetypes. In any case, he provides none. It's, again, Alexander Douglas has a lot of fair points in this, and even if at the same time it doesn't mean that some of what Peterson has provided isn't useful. Now, is it rigorously scientific? Well, that's a different standard. In many ways, I think Peterson is a preacher. I'm not saying he isn't a scientist, but in terms of what he does on stage in the biblical series and in many of his other lectures, he's a preacher, and he leverages science as illustrations. Well, I know all about that. Again, Jung faced no equivalent problem of empirical confirmation. He could prove that icons all linked up to one archetype by psychologically spelunking into the collective unconscious and digging out the evidence directly. And that's basically what he does in his books. And, I don't find it to be particularly enjoyable reading. And again, if you couldn't see the evidence yourself, so much the worse for your psychic health. Peterson's attempt to hold this Jungian theory to scientific standards is admirable, but it also kills his case. And then he'll go into some opportunistic readings of where he thinks Peterson falls short. So I will, of course, link to this article below. But for me, the real payoff here is thinking through the idea of cultural transmission and asking ourselves, well, just how much gets translated culturally, and to what degree can we know it, and how many layers of meanings can be exposed, and what does this mean in terms of more my project of trying to figure out the world going in both directions and figure out where heaven and earth meet, and seeing, instead of just sort of being a dualist and punting every time I use the word spiritual, it's really the Christian dualists who use the word spiritual in a much less sloshy way, because at least they assert some substance of there. And every time a materialist says the word spiritual, well, they're just using a word that they have absolutely no purchase or foundation for. And that's why it's so much fun asking them, well, what do you mean by spiritual? And usually what they mean is emotional. Oh, but if you're a bottom-up materialist, what is that emotion really? What is its value? Even at least if you're a Christian dualist, at least you've got something that you're making some assertion. But if we're going to, I think, as C.S. Lewis does in his book Miracles, and now Lewis is Lewis a dualist? it's very interesting because Lewis has both bottom up and top down, because in some ways everything is colonized by reason. And so, Lewis is pretty complex. And as I was reading the Cartesian dualism Wikipedia site, I noticed references to miracles and Plantinga and Fesser. And so, yeah, so this is all, and I know some of you might tire of listening to my own ongoing self-education and want to jump in and correct me and have at it to the degree that I let you. But for those of you who are just sort of following along with my own self-education and wonderings out loud, thank you. And for those of you who support this channel by either supporting Livingstone's Church in terms of our giving, or supporting me on Patreon, or even just watching my videos now that the channel is monetized, thank you. And even just thank you for your time and attention. So to me, this article sort of stuck in my head, and I'll be looking forward to reading the comments of what you think about it.